Hello, everyone, and happy last presentation of the English track of the A4Q World Congress 2nd edition. I'm very happy to introduce you to Christian Alexander Graf. He is passionate about statistics, testing strategies, and IT security. Besides teaching on different universities within Germany, he was involved in creating a material for the A4Q Certification Security Essentials and the ISTQB Specialist Security Tester. I'm so happy to have you here, Christian. We are excited about your presentation. I don't want to steal too much of your time and hand over to you. I want to say to the audience that this presentation is live. You can comment in the comment section right below the video. We are able to answer all your questions live. Thank you for being here, Christian, and now I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Jelena, and thank you and to Matthias as well for organizing the session. Good evening, everybody. This evening we will talk about the what is what in vulnerability classification. And so it's about some common patterns to describe and to classify vulnerabilities which are disclosed in many programs all over this world. So as Jelena already introduced me, I don't need to speak much about this. And so let's start with our subject matter for this evening. So what is the motivation actually for classifying vulnerabilities? And think about, we have here a system administrator who has to make sure that the system the company is working are secure, so that there are not any, like if you compare it with your house, for example, if you leave a door open or a window, it's rather easy for somebody to make a home invasion and take things that don't belong to the person. With IT security, it's basically the same. Some people that get into your house with a home invasion take things, some others break things, and some other people may leave something that will, let's say, explode your heating or something like that. And same with IT security. So you have to make sure, or the administrator has to make sure, that there are no open doors, no open windows, no key left under a mat. And now there are so many systems he has to care for and so little time to check each of them personally. So what he might need, how to do that? Well, would be a good thing if he had a wizard who could magically take a look at what vulnerabilities or what open doors and so on are there. Unfortunately, there are no wizards. Well, there are penetration testers, but usually their time is rather short and reduced, and they're expensive. Well, now next point is, in former days there were a lot of mailing lists and blogs where you could take a look and discuss known and disclosed security vulnerabilities. But the problem is, as you can see from the screenshot from sacklists.org, there were a huge number of them, and you actually don't have really the time to look them all up. But what if there would be one list to rule them all? What if there were one list where all the known vulnerabilities and the disclosed vulnerabilities were put together in a database? And good news is, this list exists. So we'll go back. If you would take a look at sacklists.org, you would see that most of these lists and mailing lists and blogs and so on are discontinued by now. So most of them stopped in 2020. And the simple reason for that is that actually everybody now hands over the things he found out to the CVE, the Common Vulnerability Enumeration. It's maintained by the MITRE, which is a non-for-profit organization which holds the intellectual property rights to make sure that the CVE remains free. And to quote, or nearly quote, the MITRE is a list. They say it's a list. I say it's a comprehensive list of publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities that is free to search, use, and incorporate into products and services. So how will our administrator now use this list? So people who aren't IT security know that. So it's more, the talk is more about people who would like to know something about it and learn how those people work. And let's take a look at how the CVE is used. First thing to make your systems sure you need is a proper configuration management. So that you have really proper lists, that you know where in your systems are which services, which programs, and so on installed in which version. If you know that, if you have such a list, you can actually use an IT security management tool that references your current versions of tools and services and servers and whatever you are using, and compares it with the CVE list to see if there are, with the versions you are using, any vulnerabilities. Then you get an alarm, or depending on how you set up your system, you may even get automated updates for your vulnerable system. So actually, you can get rid of a lot of trouble just by proper due diligence. So security management and doing these things is not a rocket science. It's, sorry for the term, it's just fucking due diligence. So if you apply proper configuration management and proper IT security management tools that reference the CVE list, you have made sure that you at least have a minimal home security. You don't have open windows, at least if you have windows that are cracked and it's known that they have a fault and there's a crack, you will know about it too. The list doesn't contain zero-day exploits. So that's really basic security what you have to do here. And so at least you can automate the basics of your security management. The other point is you still might have systems that are not on your list, that maybe are part of your shadow IT. So systems that you don't know about, systems that have been installed without your knowledge, or systems that are not properly maintained in your configuration management. And therefore, you do additional vulnerability scans and use maybe some other pen testing tools. So you have to do something to catch what went through the meshes of your configuration and security management. And also, these tools use the CVE list and have already automated testing programs and scripts to test for certain vulnerabilities and to check if you have installed any services, or if they can find by scanning any services that are on the CVE list in the proper version. Well, how is a CVE entry created? So there must be a way how these things come onto this list. And that's actually companies, security researchers, and whoever will discover a vulnerability. So if a potential vulnerability is discovered, you can report this vulnerability to a so-called CVE numbering authority. They will assign in an ID to the vulnerability and usually in contact and dialogue with you, add descriptions and references. So who are these CNA? That's very easy. Those are companies which are partners of the Mitro Corporation. They've currently, as of yesterday evening, 197 partners, including such big companies as Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, and many others. So, for example, Microsoft is responsible for vulnerability in Microsoft products, so they will create the CVE entries for anything that has to do with Microsoft. SAP will create the entries for anything that has to do with SAP. But there are also numbering authorities that are responsible for open source projects. So if you discover something in open source, you can look up which numbering authority or which CNA is responsible for a product. And then you can get a CVE for that and make sure that the CVE is published. And that's the next step. How is a CVE published? Well, there's a secretariat in Mitro organization that then publishes the entry. Okay, that's the most simple way. Of course, there are steps in between, so that an assigned vulnerability is checked if there's really a vulnerability. And so there's some process involved that somebody says, yeah, that's really a vulnerability. So we have really a defect lifecycle like in a proper defect management. And that's actually a point. One could say the CVE is a worldwide defect management for security vulnerabilities, because you also get in the CVE entries informations whether there are workarounds, secure configuration where you might mitigate a vulnerability, or if there are already patches available and for which versions. And from which versions on, there's no more patch required because the loophole has been stuffed, so because there has been a fix added to the program. So let's say our CVE is basically some kind of defect management for security vulnerabilities. Now, a proper defect management system also needs a proper classification system. Well, we have a number now for the defect, a unique worldwide number for any disclosed vulnerability. And then we need to assign a severity. So typical classifications in such a defect management systems are the severity. How bad is that? How bad is the vulnerability, or how bad is the bug? How big is the bite that you can take? Then we need a classification of the type of defect. So what's actually in the source code, what's wrong? And many classification systems also contain a type of trigger, a classification of the trigger. How can it happen that the defect is triggered and becomes an issue, becomes really a failure in the system, or somebody breaks into your system in a way, in case of a security vulnerability. Now let's take a look. What are these? So what describes the severity of a common vulnerability? What describes the type of defect? And what describes the trigger? And there we have three more classifications. The first one that describes the severity is the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is now available in the version 3.1. Okay, there are several versions of this stuff too. And that has been created by an organization called FIRST, and they specialize in incident response. The other two are also from MITRE and maintained by MITRE. The type of defect can be described as a weakness. So something which is in a source code or in a hardware that, if it can be accessed by an attacker, becomes a vulnerability. So a weakness is always a potential vulnerability. So it's actually what you would have referred to in software as a defect, what is in the code, or in the hardware, what is wrong that can become a failure. That's actually then can be classified by the common weakness enumeration. And at last, the trigger, the way an attacker can get at the weakness to exploit it, that's the CAPEC, the MITRE's Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification. So let's take a closer look at these three, starting with the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. So this is a rather elaborate classification of severity of vulnerabilities. And we actually assess 8 vectors. The first one is the attack vector. So how easy is it to get at a vulnerability? For example, can I access it from everywhere on the internet, or do I need actually physical access to a system to exploit the vulnerability? So that's actually described by the attack vector. The second one is the attack complexity, which basically considers if I can do an attack anytime, or if I need special circumstances, like, for example, which often happen with race conditions or something like that. The third one considers if I need privileges. So, for example, will I have to be a user with credentials to the system? Will I have to be even an administrator, or can I access the system anonymously and do mischief? That's the privilege required. Then, will I require help from the user? Like, for example, pressing an OK button when a funny message appears. So is user interaction required? Yes or no? The third one is the scope. And that means actually is only the vulnerable system really affected, or can I affect other systems as well? Like, for example, with the cache poisoning. And I just see there's a question from Martin Roman here, who asks what is the difference between a weakness and a vulnerability. To explain it once more, a vulnerability or a weakness becomes a vulnerability if you have a chance to access it. So a weakness for itself might not pose a problem unless there's an attack vector where an attacker really can exploit the weakness. And that's the moment when it becomes a vulnerability. That's, for example, described and defined in that way in the common criteria standard. There we'll find that definition. So I was just stuck with the user interaction. No, I was just stuck with the scope. So if only the attack system is affected by the vulnerability at first, fine. But if other systems might be affected, so that something like an avalanche attack or so, then actually the scope becomes higher and the score calculation goes higher as well. And then finally, the impact on the typical security triad confidentiality, integrity, and availability is assessed. And usually with not at all, 0, low, or high. So is there an impact on confidentiality? Is confidentiality, for example, not affected, is low, or is it high? Is integrity affected so that you might change data? Or is the availability affected so that you might use the vulnerability to stage a denial of service attack? And from your choice for all of these properties, then a score is calculated. The formula is a little bit complicated, but of course there's a standard that explains how the score is calculated. And there are websites like, for example, on the NIST website, there's a calculator that you can use to calculate a common vulnerability score. Also, there are additional available scores, like, for example, temporal scores, because severity of vulnerability may evolve over time. First of all, there might be only a proof of concept, and there might be elaborate scripts that you can download to stage an attack. So you can modify the base score, or you can add an environmental score, because maybe a system is vulnerable that is well protected within an intranet. And so your personal score or your enterprise score for a vulnerability might need to be adapted. Then let's take a look at classifying the attack patterns using CAPEC. Actually, CAPEC is really a comprehensive list of potential attack patterns, because it describes 546 different attack patterns. There are two main categories, or you can actually sort them by mechanism of attack, which contains 9 major categories, like, for example, deceptive interactions, abusing existing functionality, abusing existing data structures, and so on. And also the domain from which or about which the attack is staged, like over the software, over the hardware, or over the supply chain. To name another category, which I haven't mentioned here, are there to look for the proper description of the attack pattern for the vulnerability you found. And for some CVE entries, the attack pattern is given as well as the common weakness enumeration. I will show you in a moment how you can use CAPEC as well, and we will do in the end an example of how to classify a vulnerability with all three of our defect descriptions, like CVSS, CWE, and our CAPEC pattern. Okay, now we go for the common weakness enumeration, and this is even more comprehensive than the CAPEC. So we have 1,282 weaknesses as of July 20, 2021. That was when the website which shows the numbers of weaknesses which are on the list was updated the last time. At least I checked yesterday, and the date was still the same. And you can also sort them and categorize them by weaknesses in software development, by weaknesses in hardware design, by research concepts. And since there are so many that you can't look for them all, there's a top 25. So if you're doing, for example, a code review, or use a static scanner, a static analyzer, for example, you should at least look for the top 25 of the software weaknesses. So they have a top list, which you can also use when you're trying to develop secure systems. Okay, how to use CAPEC and CWE? Well, both you can use in design reviews as well as code reviews, where you use CWE more in code reviews and in static analysis, and CAPEC more in design reviews and threat models. But also in threat models, you will also use CWE, which you can see at a flip chart behind me, which is unfortunately just only written in German. But the basic idea is, if you analyze a system, you look for attack vectors and potential attack patterns that you could use on that systems. And there's also for each attack pattern a list of potential weaknesses that can be exploited by the attack pattern. And then you can check whether this weakness could appear in the system. So that's the way also can use that for penetration tests, and of course in threat modeling and in design reviews. And that's the second point. You can use that to design and plan penetration tests in the mentioned way as shown behind me on the flip chart. So to close my talk, let's do an example, and we choose a rather well-known and classic vulnerability, namely the Heartbleed bug. TLS protocol uses actually a keep alive pattern or check pattern, which is called Heartbeat. And the idea of Heartbeat is that you send a package to a server via the TLS protocol, and your package contains a length field that says how long is your payload or how big is your payload. Like, for example, you say, I'm going to send three letters like X, Y, Z, and then TLS should actually send back these letters to you. So you just take a random set of letters so that you also know when something comes back, that is really what you sent to the TLS server, and you know that the connection is working. That's basically the idea. Unfortunately, in one of the TLS versions, somebody introduced a bug where actually the length of the sent message was really not used to construct the message that was sent back. Instead of checking the length of the sent message, the length field was trusted. And what you could do now, you could say, okay, I'm sending 100 characters, and when in reality you only did send 3 characters. What happened now? You were sent back 100 characters. First the 3 characters that you did send, and then anything else what is following memory. Could have been email addresses, could have been encryption keys, could have been passwords, whatever was in memory. So if you know such a server has had this vulnerability, you just go phishing. You just send a lot of packages to vulnerable servers, and you start to collect data and skim later through the data to see what you can find on interesting information there. So that was the bug. And now we are going to classify that bug, the Heartbleed bug. First of all, we will calculate the CVSS score for that using the version 3.1. The attack vector, you could do that from anywhere in the network because you only had to craft packages. So the attack vector is the whole internet, it's the network. The attack complexity is low because you can do that anytime. If the server is vulnerable, you can just ask for the Heartbeat package to be sent back, and you will get your information, whatever you get. Yeah, like Christmas. Yeah, like the play where you give something to somebody else and you don't know what is in the package that you're receiving. You just try to give as many packages away and see what you can get, if this is useful. So really a Christmas for cyber criminals. Then privilege required and none. Anybody can do that. Anybody can send a package to server. User interaction is also not required. It's an automatic answering service of the server. The scope is unchanged because, first of all, only the confidentiality of the attacked server is compromised, but you don't know what you get. So it's not sure that you can really compromise with that another system, although it's very likely that you might do that. The impact on confidentiality is high because you can get anything what's in the memory. The impact on integrity is none because you can't destroy anything, you can't change anything really on the system, but you can get everything what's in memory. And the impact on availability is also none because you can't use this actually for denial of service attack. And if you put that in the calculator for the CVSS, you get a score of 7.5, which is high. You might try that with the calculator on the NIST web page, for example, if you like. Then let's see if we can classify the attack pattern and the weakness that belongs to that. And so the vulnerability was described in the CVE list as a remote attacker can obtain sensitive information from process memory in OpenSSL 101 up to 101G. And again, here we have the CVE number. And if we take a look at the corresponding weakness, what we did here is actually that what was actually happening in the program, that the true message buffer size was not checked when copying memory into content into the message buffer. And that's a CWE 125, that's the number of that weakness, an out of bounds read. You'll find that also in the list. And there's an attack pattern, a CAPEC pattern going with that, namely the buffer overread through buffer manipulation, which is actually the manipulation of a data structure. That's on the top level of that. So we have a unique CAPEC classification, the CAPEC 540, and we have a unique weakness that goes with that attack, the CWE 125. So we really have a unique identification for our vulnerability. So that was my talk. Thank you for listening to the talk, and I hope you enjoy the last minutes and hours of our A4Q World Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for this very nice presentation. For now, it seems like there were no further questions, but you can find Christian on social media, like on LinkedIn, for example, and if there are any further questions coming up afterwards, just let him know. Or on the other hand, you can send an email to A4Q and we will forward this question. Yeah. Thank you for being here and for having like the last presentation of the English track for today.
Thank you very much, Jelena, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. You too. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye-bye.